Hi there. One of the things I am being asked most frequently is how do I manage my time? And so I think time management is something that concerns a lot of people because in our academic life there's a lot of demands on our time from different directions. And I always thought, I don't think I have a particular time management strategy, so maybe I shouldn't be making a movie, but here is my take on the story, and we're starting right now. I think the most important point is that this is not one size fits all. I mean, there are some people in my lab that use very sophisticated apps to schedule their various tasks and to keep track of their progress through time. There's people that do it on paper, and there's people that have extensive lists of what they do every day in various shapes and forms, and I don't do anything like this. And so I think the most important thing to take away from this is you need to figure out what works for you, because what I do, it may not work for you at all. At the same time, when you see somebody using sophisticated software for keeping track of progress of various tasks, you may be intimidated by that, but at the same time, this may simply not be for you. So you need to kind of play around and figure out what works for you, because that's the most important thing. And I think this is the most important message of this video right there. Well, so when I look at what I do, I don't do any of these apps. I don't keep any track of any progress. I don't use any scheduling software. I don't have any lists of what I do in any given day. So I think to most people I must seem pretty disorganized, and maybe I am, I don't know, but I in the end get stuff done. And so when I thought about what I could talk about basically in this video, I came up with about 8 or so points that I want to share with you in terms of some of the decisions that I make and some of the things that are important to me in terms of managing my time. The first one is I prioritize tasks about output. Output for us is basically manuscripts. And so there's rarely a manuscript that sits on my desk for longer than just a few days. In fact, very often I turn around manuscripts in the lab within 1 or 2 days. Of course, sometimes it doesn't work, or if a manuscript requires a lot of work, then it will take longer. But given the processes that we have established in the lab about when to share manuscripts with me and so on and so forth, there is generally a very quick turnaround. And that's because I prioritize these tasks. When a manuscript comes from one of the lab members on my desk and also from collaborators, then I make that a priority and it goes to the top of the non-existing list, which means like this is the thing that I will do that day. So prioritize things that are related to output. The second thing is something that I actually had to work quite hard on, and this is to delegate. I know there's a lot of people out there that have trouble with delegation, I think, because they feel like they need to always look over everything and have input on every various step of any process. And I think this is a recipe, especially when you have a relatively large lab. I mean, our lab is, depending on your count, on how you count, but over 40 people. And so I think that you cannot do that, right? So, I mean, you need to have trust in people, and you need to be able to delegate certain tasks. Otherwise, this will not work. And I know this is very hard for some people, and I know that some people are basically having a very hard time with this. The micromanagement, they are sort of a micromanager for every step, and that will not work well. And it's basically an endless sink for your time. So number 2 is delegate tasks whenever you're comfortable with it. And of course, these things are all connected to each other, right? I mean, you can delegate tasks to people that you have built trust in. This happens over time, of course. And this means you need to learn how to build trust. And this means you need to have the right people in the lab. And this means you need to try to make good hiring decisions so you have the right people in the lab. So it's all a bit connected to how you run a lab. And of course, you cannot control all these things, but you can control them to a certain extent. And I think that that's how it fits all together. The third one is, well, you know, I think this is the best job in the world, and this is an awesome thing that we do here in this lab, generally speaking, but there are always some tasks that I do not enjoy, and then just, I'm sure like everybody else, I push them ahead of me, and they hang over me like a dark cloud. I know I need to do them, and then eventually I need to do it. But then what I've especially more recently really tried to do is like to minimize the time I spend on these tasks that I don't like. So they are usually paperwork, bureaucracy kind of tasks that are sort of, well, just a plague. And they're absolutely no fun whatsoever. That they don't advance me professionally in terms of my thinking. They're just kind of things that we need to do also as part of this job. It's just unavoidable. And then I just make sure that I allow myself a certain period of time, usually before some other meeting or some other thing starts, and I say like, okay, in this 15 minutes, I write this letter or whatever, or I send this response to some funding agency or whatever it is, the things that I don't enjoy, or like writing some justification for something, you name it, like your favorite, least favorite bureaucratic task inserted here. So then I have a limited period of time to do it. I do it best that I can during this time, and then it's done. And that works well, because if you sit on it and work on it over longer periods of time, then you end up spending a lot of time on things that you don't like. And there is, I think, this Parkinson's law that basically time always expands to fill the time slot that you allow for a certain task. And so, if you give yourself half an hour to answer this particular bureaucratic question or task, then it will take half an hour. But if you say, I will do it in 15 minutes, the best that I can, and then call it good, it will take 15 minutes. So I think this is another important feature, is like trying to minimize the time spent on things that you don't really enjoy to the extent possible. Well, the next one is streamlining communication. Of course, with a large lab, there is a lot of communicating to be done, and is of course important, and I like it. But it's also important to streamline it. And there have actually been some recent changes in that were sort of pandemic related, that I think I found very helpful and have increased sort of my efficiency and output overall. And that is to sort of limit the time of interaction to certain periods. So of course we meet as a lab quite a lot. We have 2 weekly lab meetings every Monday and every Thursday. They're each 1.5 hours. So this is a lot of interaction time. And then what I have offered is also every morning a coffee chat. Is just 15 minutes, and whoever has a point that they'd like to discuss, they can just pop in. There's no registration or scheduling necessary. You just pop in. And then we have Slack, so there's a communication tool in the lab where I basically have, at the end of the day, I have 0 unanswered messages, which is quite different from my email, which is a disaster. But it's basically within the lab, the communication to the people that sort of matter most, because they're in my group, that unanswered message count at the end of the day is always 0, because this is sort of, I always answer to all these questions, but it's all communication within the lab. But it's streamlined. It is not endless, because I used to have an open door policy where basically my door was always open, and basically people would come in like a steady stream of people, and that would always interrupt me in whatever I'm doing, and then it would take again the time to refocus, and this is sort of time spent less efficiently. And so now this is all streamlined. Also, to make sure that I really interact with everybody in the lab writes to me a very, very short bulleted list kind of weekly report every Monday. So then I have sort of a conversation with everybody. That's sort of a conversation that can take place over a day or 2, because whenever you send me the report, then I will send you a reply within like a few hours, and there may be some questions in your report. I will also respond to those, but it's all basically streamlined to this particular interaction. And I think that works very well, and it allows me to communicate fairly efficiently with a large group of people, to the extent that this is really possible, right? But there's all the other mechanisms in place as well. So there is cascade mentoring and people helping each other out, people working in teams. So of course, this is all works together basically. But in terms of the communication with me, I think this is sort of a no threshold basically way of communicating with me via this internal communication tool, via the prompted reports every week that are just in the Google Doc. And I think this streamlining communication, this really helps a lot with time management. Well, the 5th one is learn to say no. This is easier said than done, because you also don't want to close yourself off to opportunity by saying no to something that may, in the end, turn out to be very beneficial. And I am having a hard time saying no, but sometimes I say no when there's just no benefit to the lab, myself, or other people, or when it's just too much at a given point in time. So it's important to say no, but this is also kind of, let's say an art or something, to know when you can say no and when you're just closing yourself off to an opportunity that you really should make the time for. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I do say no. So, and of course, then once you have said no to that, then it's not an additional set of tasks that will always pop up. And I guess what also is part of that is when you are thinking about agreeing to take on a responsibility, to be on some board or whatever, then I think it's important, and I always do, to figure out how much time will that cost. Is it like hours every week? Then chances are no. Is it like an hour every month? Okay, sounds more like yes. So I think it's important to make this clear, so also that you don't let people down, but it's also important to know for yourself what can you actually still pile on that plate, because you already have a full plate, right? So I think it's important to always ask just before you're committing to something, how much time will that take, basically. Now, the next one is block your time to work on something that you're really passionate about. And I know this is also easier than it sounds, but to the extent possible, make yourself a period of uninterrupted work by just blocking that out, by not responding to anything else, by having it actually maybe even scheduled, even though I don't do that. I like to keep my schedule as clean as possible, have as few appointments as I can possibly get away with. So I also don't schedule things that I do myself, but mentally I say like, well, this morning I will work for 2 hours on this idea that I've had. And then I just do it and then don't get interrupted by other things. This is sometimes, of course, not possible when there's other things that are demanding your attention. But to the extent possible, try to block working on a project that's really important to you, because I think it makes you work more efficiently on something rather than getting constantly interrupted and having to refocus every time. Well, the next one is to get really started early on something. And again, this is sort of something that doesn't come necessarily very easy on me. And I almost think that sometimes I work better under pressure. When I have little time, I actually get more done. I need to think about that in more detail before I dispense that as a piece of advice, which probably would be terrible advice. But I think what I've made good experiences with also is that get started early on something that is sort of a big chunk that you need to take care of. Like, is it a new class to design, or is it like a large grant proposal? You know, you need to really start months in advance. Like for an ERC grant, maybe like 6 months in advance. You start like sketching the work packages and start writing things down, and also you collect information, because then you collect information over time. It becomes not as much at any given point in time that is on you in terms of what you need to deliver on, but you have like little packages then, and you start working on little things over time, and over time like your document has started to grow. So I think this is also a very good way to avoid these times when you're being overloaded in terms of having to deliver on some major task. Start early, divide it over a longer period of time, chip away at that problem sort of very gradually, and so then in the end you can still deliver. Well, right, and finally is you cannot be a perfectionist. This sounds almost counterintuitive for a scientist, because of course you want to do everything perfectly and always be super careful about everything and have thought everything completely through. The fact of the matter is, if you're a perfectionist, I mean, every experiment will drive you insane, right? Because there's so many things that are unpredicted and so many things that you haven't possibly thought of that come along, or like no paper will ever be finished, because of course you can always make it better by reading it again and again and again and revising it and sending it to somebody to read, and then working it again and making the figures better and making the logical flow improved and whatever. It never ends, right? Nothing that we do ever ends. You can also make every lecture and every course always better by getting better examples, by having better display items. None of these things that we do in teaching, research, and service, so if as faculty members, but also if you're a postdoc or PhD students, none of the things you can do are basically ever done. You can always do better. And I think perfectionism is an absolute enemy. It eats up endless amounts of your time, and so at some point there is sort of a diminishing return, right? And it's an experience that tells you when it's good enough. Like, I can always work on a paper another month, but I think it's also good enough. And then it will be sent to reviews. They will also have useful comments. And then it will appear and that project is finished. I think that comes also with experience, but I think it's just generally probably super important advice. You cannot be a perfectionist. You have to call it quits at, like, I don't know, when it is 70, 80%. Otherwise, it becomes a bottomless pit of time that you sink into everything you do and you will make no progress. So basically, you can learn to be more efficient. You can collaborate with others to make it better overall as a product, to have multiple points of view integrated in a paper, for example, or in a project. So there's very many ways to make it better. But at some point, you also got to call it good. And I think that's an essential skill that is difficult sort of for people that are starting out in science to have already, you know, fully mastered. But I think it is absolutely a requirement also for time management. Well, so I hope these 8 points that I have had to think about for this video, since I never really thought about it before, will maybe be helpful to you. But I think the most important advice I gave you already at the beginning of the video: try out what works for you. Don't get like flustered when you see somebody with their fancy software or the extensive planning. This may be good for you, and by all means try it out, expose yourself to this as a possibility, because it really will make it better for you. And then it's great, because this is the bottom line. Will it work for you? Then do it. At the same time, also understand that what works for somebody else, like for me, it may not work for you. So you need to figure out what is the best way for you to go about managing your time. So thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.